استفن هارپر، نخست وزیر کانادا 2006 تا 2015. رئیس اتحاد بین المللی احزاب دموکرات در 80 کشور جهان.
معترضان این بار خانه اجدادی خمینی را به آتش کشیدند. دفعه بعد تمامیت رژیم را به آتش خواهند کشید و نابود خواهند کرد.
14 ماه قبل از سقوط رژیم شاه، کارتر رئیس جمهور آمریکا به شاه گفت ایران تحت رهبری شما جزیره ثبات است. اگر رژیم شاه آسیب پذیر بود، رژیم آخوندها به مراتب آسیب پذیرتر است.
زنان مدت هاست نقش رهبری کننده را در مقاومت سازمان یافته در برابر رژیم ایفا کردند. زنانی مانند رئیس جمهور مریم رجبی. علتش این است که زنان ایرانی می‌دانند که حقوق پایه‌ای انسانی آنها در گرو نابودی این رژیم و ایدئولوژی ارتجاعی آن و جایگزینی آن با یک حکومت آزاد و دموکراتیک با جدایی دین و دولت است.
بیایید تفکر اساسی مماشاتگران را به چالش بکشیم. اینکه اوضاع می‌تواند در صورت سرنگونی رژیم بدتر بشود. چطور ممکن است بدتر از رژیمی باشد که ولی فقیه آن یک متعصب افراطی و رئیس جمهور آن یک جلاد قتل عام است؟ چطور ممکن است بدتر از این باشد؟
پس راه حل این نیست که تلاش کنیم روابط را با این رژیم تقویت کنیم، بلکه این است که کاری را انجام بدهیم که دولت من در کانادا انجام داد: بستن سفارتخانه‌های رژیم در سراسر جهان.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Distingués invités internationaux, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, friends. We meet here today to mark roughly 1 year since the death of one woman, Mahsa Amini, set off nationwide protests against the theocratic dictatorship in Iran. Today, the regime and its appeasers in the West will proclaim that the protests have subsided, never to return. But we know the opposite is true. The protests will return, as they have returned before, and each time they return, they are more widespread, more aggressive, and more enduring than they were before. Just as each time they are more brutally suppressed, with more imprisonment and with more deaths, so that they lay the groundwork for the next round of protests. And so the cycle of protest and repression returns and returns, but it also escalates and escalates until it ends the only way it can end, with the people of Iran liberated from that vicious and evil regime. This time, friends, the protesters burned down the ancestral home of the regime's founder, Ayatollah Khomeini. Next time, they will burn the entire regime to the ground. As I said, each time the protests expand from the city to the countryside, and this last time from men to women. Although, in fact, women have long played a leading role in organized resistance to the regime. Women, of course, like President Maryam Rajavi. And they have because Iranian women have long known that their basic human rights depend on the destruction of the regime and its primitive ideology, and its replacement by a free, constitutional, secular, and democratic state. And friends, the forces exist on the ground in Iran to bring that future into being. As I've told you before, dismiss the propaganda that the regime is well entrenched and that it has no organized opposition. If the regime had no such opposition, why would it expend so much energy in denouncing and demonizing this organization, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and all its organs and cells? If such opposition did not exist, why would the regime imprison at this moment some 3,500 of your members? No, friends, the regime's propaganda betrays its own lies. But I tell you, not just to dismiss the propaganda of the regime, but also the propaganda of the regime's appeasers in the West. For they claim much the same thing, that there is no organized resistance, no viable alternative to the vile theocracy and all that it stands for. Dismiss the propaganda of Western appeasers, these self-styled experts, and dismiss them not just because their propaganda is morally reprehensible, but because it is also factually wrong. It always is. Appeasers have always consistently overestimated the strength of regimes that govern solely by brute force, and consistently underestimated the underlying fragility and inevitable fall of such regimes. The appeasers have been wrong whenever and wherever they have put such claims forward. But incredibly, on Iran, they were already wrong once before, when they assured us that the Shah's regime was all-powerful and would forever be in control. Just 14 months before that regime fell, U.S. President Jimmy Carter told a state dinner that the Shah, and I quote, "Iran under your leadership is an island of stability." Almost a year after that, the CIA reiterated that, and again I quote, "Iran is not in a revolutionary or even pre-revolutionary situation." Only 5 months later, the Shah fled the country, and his regime simply evaporated. And friends, as I've said before, if the Shah's regime was vulnerable, how much more vulnerable is the Ayatollah's? The Ayatollah's regime is even more dysfunctional. It faces even more overt opposition, and it has been rotting at the core almost from day one. Corruption is alive at every level. The economy only gets worse. Poverty keeps increasing. Inflation keeps rising. Services are non-existent. No wonder the regime must resort to ever greater brutality, because it has nothing that would engender the loyalty of any ordinary citizen. So it resorts to ever greater brutality, but it must do so with ever-shrinking resources, except, of course, when a Western government actually sends it resources, as the Biden administration recently did once again, $6 billion. What a disgrace that is. Imagine the regime claiming that they have been subject to a cyber attack. The regime itself is one of the single biggest cyber hackers in the entire world. So we call upon the government of Albania to respect the fundamental rights of the people of Ashraf and to stand with them against the regime in Tehran. Friends, let us again challenge the fundamental premise behind the appeasers' belief system, that somehow things could be worse if the regime fell. Worse? How? How could it be worse than a regime with an apocalyptic ideology and a relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons that openly lists the nations it wishes to wipe off the face of the earth? How could it be worse than that? How could it be worse than a regime that funds terrorism and war from Syria to Lebanon to Yemen and Iraq and even to Ukraine and beyond. How could it be worse than that? How could it be worse than a regime where the supreme leader is an extremist fanatic and its president is a mass executioner? How could it be worse than that? So friends, I'll say it again. The solution is not to try to strengthen relations with this regime. It is to do what my government did in Canada, close down the regime's embassies around the world. Now, friends, in talking about the alternative to the regime, and of course there is such an alternative, I've always been very careful to say that it's not my place to tell the Iranian people who should be their government. That is for Iranians to decide. I remind you that I am signatory to an open letter of over 100 former presidents and prime ministers from around the world that urges the globe to ignore the appeasers and instead to reach out to organized Iranian resistance. It's really simple. Stand with the Iranian resistance and in solidarity with the people of Iran in their desire for a free, secular, and democratic state. And friends, that is the future that you, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, have constantly and tirelessly advocated, something that needs to be acknowledged by all governments. Your commitment to free elections, to freedom of assembly and expression, to pluralism and the rule of law, to human rights and gender equality, to the separation of religion and state, to the autonomy of Iran's ethnicities, and of course, to a non-nuclear nation at peace with the world. That is the vision on which you have staked your claim, and I believe it is a vision that the vast swath of the Iranian people are yearning to get behind. So keep up the fight, keep the organs and cells of this organization in Iran and around the world active and fighting for that vision. Do so, friends, and it will come to pass just as this regime will pass away. Thank you for having me again. Merci beaucoup.